Hey, what's up Seekers? Welcome back to our second video in our series of pantheism. If you missed our first video, which was introduction, we gave a definition of pantheism, we spoke a bit about its history, how and when the term was coined. Check out our video here. We're now going to talk about the history of pantheism, the history of the idea as found in different religious and philosophical traditions across the world, and we are beginning our history by looking at some Eastern forms of pantheism. We're going to follow it up with philosophy of pantheism and some other fun stuff, so make sure to stick around, subscribe, and check out this epic series. Just for those who were not paying attention in the last video, in the introduction where we defined mysticism, I want to give you one final word about definition from Constance Plumtree. It's a funny name, but she is a serious scholar, and she wrote a historical overview of pantheism, one of the first of its kind, and in her introduction she writes this: "It must be admitted that the word pantheism requires to be defined. It is notoriously a very vague term, and has been used by a variety of writers in a variety of ways, many of which are very indefinite and obscure. If we consult the various encyclopedias and dictionaries, they unite for the most part in describing pantheism as the doctrine which identifies God with the universe." And we like when things unite here at Seekers of Unity. So that is a running definition. Now, to be fair, many of the thinkers and schools of thought in the following historical sketch may be more accurately categorized as panentheists rather than pantheists. Panentheists, literally, all is in God. A position which leaves room for divine transcendence, in addition to divine immanence that we find in pantheism. But because in this video series we are presenting pantheists, we'll be focusing on the pantheistic side of things. Another disclaimer before we launch into the Eastern religions. It may be fair to attribute pantheism to early indigenous and native traditions that predate recorded human history, believing as they did that all things were filled with gods. But because we want to focus on the more monistic, unitive expressions of pantheism, we're going to save our discussion of those prehistoric traditions for a video focusing on animism and shamanism and panpsychism and things of that nature. As you might imagine, choosing what to focus on and what to explore is quite a difficult task. But unless we took the discretion to do so, any video that touches on any core theme of mysticism would become a video essentially about all of mysticism, impoverishing us of the ability to discern, differentiate, and individuate certain themes and streams within the world of mysticism. So forgive me if I miss out your favorite historical pantheist in the historical presentation we're going to do. If it wasn't a simple mistake and oversight, it was an attempt on my behalf to avoid cooking up one big scrambled eggs of mysticism, which has been done so many times before. So here's instead for some sunny side up history of mysticism. We're going to begin with Hinduism. Now, Hinduism and the Dharmic Vedic traditions is super old. Amongst its practitioners, it's referred to as the eternal tradition because of its antiquity. And pinning down its exact origins is indeed a matter of great difficulty, if not an impossibility. Hinduism, in the way the term is used today, is more of an umbrella term containing a plethora of philosophical and religious phenomena practiced by one of the world's oldest civilizations. With over 1.25 billion adherents, or 15% of the world's population today, and contains a huge, complex, diverse theology, united by some key elements. Now, I'm no expert of anything, let alone mysticism, but what I want to try and trace out with you today is a little developmental trajectory of Hindu theology, pointing out its pantheistic destination, and bringing up some canonical texts to back up the survey. Early Vedantic Hinduism appears to be best categorized as polytheism or henotheism. Polytheism is the belief that there are many gods. Henotheism is the belief that there are many gods, but our God is the best out of all the gods. Although, even very on, we see some shades of early pantheistic speculation. For example, the concept of an underlying order to the cosmos is found in the Vedantic idea of Rita. I hope I'm not mispronouncing that. Akin perhaps to the role that Logos plays, the ordering reason of the cosmos, in Stoic pantheism, which we will get into when we talk about Greek pantheism. Don't worry, that will be in the next video, I think. Also, the god of fire, Agni, appears frequently in early Vedantic texts and is understood to penetrate all of reality. The Vedas, by the way, that I'm talking about, are the oldest strata of sacred Hindu canonical scripture. Not to get too carried away with the Stoic Vedic comparison, but anyone who's aware of a bit of Stoic cosmology will know that the aforementioned Logos was equated with a handful of things. One of them, nature, the other, borrowing from Heraclitus, was fire. Now, how do you like that? In what may very well be the earliest indication of pantheistic worldview in all of religious literature, East or West, is a popular Hindu creation myth from the Rig Veda, dated to more than a millennia BCE, where Purusha, a cosmic being, was sacrificed by the gods in order to supply from his body the pieces from which all aspects of the world would arise. This motif of the dismembered deity, whose body is partitioned to provide the material to create the world, is a theme that we find across world mythologies. From ancient China in the myth of Pangu, to Norse mythology, the myth of Ymir, to ancient Egyptian and Greek in the idea of the sparagmos, and has strong pantheistic undertones, where the end product of the cosmos is the body of the god. That's pretty pantheistic. Check out our video on comparative mythology, here, for a brief sketch of that idea. To interpret the import of this early Vedantic perspective into a little more modern metaphysical language, we would say that the ground of all being lies in a cosmic self, and all existence participates in the unfolding of that principle called Purusha. It is for good reason that the Vedic hymn to Purusha recounting the creation myth is regarded by scholars as the starting point of Hindu pantheism, in what can be seen retrospectively as a major theological breakthrough. Near the end of the Vedas is the concept of Brahman, an introduction which would go on to become the supreme theological principle from which all things were seen as originating. This concept of Brahman was developed in great length in many later works of the Hindu canon, including the Upanishads, a series of commentaries on the Vedas, and the most important sacred scriptures of Hinduism. In Hindu mythology, Brahman is both transcendent and immanent, the absolute infinite essence, the sum total of all that ever was and all that ever will be. And the analogy to which manifests reality and the multifaceted aspects of God is related to Brahman, the source of all reality, is compared to the rays of the sun that emerge from the sun, a metaphor which is widely employed across from Platonism to Kabbalah, where the rays of the sun are within the sun, are of the sun, and yet as they emerge from the sun, they individuate from the sun and become something of their own entity, but still relying on the sun as their source. Another corollary key Hindu doctrine to that of Brahman is that of the self, the soul, Atman in Hinduism, which is seen as identical with Brahman, essentially teaching that the self, or the true self rather, is identical with God. And because this God is essentially conceptualized as identical with all of reality, this means that you too in Hinduism are all of reality. And this is precisely what we find in what's known as the four great sayings of the Upanishads. One, Ayam Atma Brahman, Atman, the self, is Brahman, God. And Tattvam Asi, that thou art that, you are the essence of existence that you encounter in all things that exist. This is the religious truths taught by Hinduism. Now, to be fair, the way gargantuan religions like these are practiced practically are very different from the way that they are presented and conceptualized in textbooks and YouTube videos, neatly packaged down into a 10-minute version, vacuum-packed for a foreign religious consumer like myself. And even though it would be nice to believe that all 1.25 billion Hindus engage in some sort of refined, abstract, theologically compelling, and metaphysically complex, non-dualistic philosophy, in reality, folk religion is what dominates widespread religious practice, where a countless pantheon of personal gods hold sway, manifesting in all aspects of life and reality. But when push comes to shove, they are all considered to be one aspect of the divine Brahman. This being the case, even the worship of a limitless amount of deities still points to a way which 15% of the world's population connect with an epic, unified, pantheistic god called Brahman. This might be a little sacrilegious, but I'd like to read a little mashup of pantheistic quotes from an assortment of sacred Hindu texts, among them the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita primarily, just to give you a first-hand taste of the textual flavor of this epic cosmic poetry of Hindu pantheism / Panentheism. The first few I'm going to read are from various Upanishads. Verily, this whole world is Brahman, from which he comes forth, without which he will be dissolved, and in which he breathes. Brahman indeed was this in the beginning. It knew itself only as I am Brahman. Therefore it became all. Whoever among the gods became aware to this, he indeed became that. Whoever knows thus, I am Brahman, becomes this all. Then he realized, I am this creation, for I have put it forth from myself. In that way he became this creation. Thou art the dark blue bird, and the green parrot with red eyes. Thou hast the lightning as thy child. Thou art the seasons and the seas. And now for some quotes from the Bhagavad Gita. I see thee whose face is burning fire, burning this whole universe with thy radiance. By me all this universe is pervaded through my unmanifested form. All beings abide in me, but I do not abide in them. Over there we have the panentheistic side of things. I'm in them, they're not all in me. And finally, I am taste in Vora, son of Kunti. I am light in the moon and sun. The sacred syllable Om, and all the Vedas. Sound in either, manliness in men. I am the goodly odor in earth. You know that smell? And brilliance in fire am I. Life in all things and austerity in aesthetics am I. Know me as the eternal seed of all beings. I am intelligence of the intelligent. Majesty of the majestic am I. I am the sole Gudakesha that abides in the heart of all beings. This is obviously going to be a lot to talk about, but if we can try and abstract some of the psychology from this mythopoetic descriptions, there's a very interesting point being made here, but we'll have to get to this another time or else we're going to go into a long tangent here. I'm well aware how inadequate of a survey of Hinduism and Hindu pantheism this was. To really cover it might take more videos than YouTube is able to handle. For just an example of another Hindu pantheism with really cool similarities to Jewish mysticism is the Shakti/Tantra cosmology, where Shakti, the personification of the source of energy of the cosmos, is identified with the universe itself and the embodiment of all action and all existence, with Shiva being her transcendent masculine aspect, providing the divine ground of all being. Quote, there is no Shiva without Shakti, or Shakti without Shiva. The two in themselves are one. Thus, it is she who becomes the time and space, the cosmos itself. It is she who becomes the five elements, and thus all animate life and inanimate forms. She is the primordial energy that holds all creation and destruction, all cycles of birth and death, all laws of cause and effect within herself, and yet is greater than the sum total of all these. She is transcendent, but becomes immanent as the cosmos. She, the immortal energy, becomes matter. Isn't that a cool quote? Now, without making any direct comparisons, because that might be a bit much, anyone who knows Jewish mysticism or Bohemian mysticism or a handful of any other mystical traditions well enough should see some really, really interesting comparisons jumping out at them without me needing to spell it out for them. The relationship between the masculine and feminine energy and matter, etc., etc. And that wraps up Hinduism for us. Before getting to Buddhism, I'd like to just say a few words about Daoism. Daoism stands alongside Confucianism as one of the two great religious/philosophical systems of China. The roots of Daoism go back at least to the 4th century BCE, and was deeply influenced by one of the oldest texts of Chinese literature, the I Ching, the Book of Changes, which teaches a philosophical system about keeping human behavior in accordance and in line with the changing, unpredictable patterns of nature, and is traced back to two founding figures, Lao Tzu and the philosopher Zhuangzi, and the work attributed to the former, the Tao Te Ching. Daoism teaches how to live in harmony with and become one with the Tao. Although we cannot say much exactly about what the Tao is, because the Tao which is spoken of is not the true Tao. Literally, the way, the Tao is, and already I should stop there, because simply saying that the Tao is already saying way too much. But we'll do the best with this thing called language and her beautifully inadequate words. I apologize that I don't have what it takes to communicate the Tao to you through some interpretive dance. The Tao is the source and substance of everything that exists, the underlying natural order, the rhythms and patterns of the universe. The Tao is eternally nameless, and the countless named things of which we know are seen as the many manifestations of the Tao, the man-made labels and demarcations on a unified reality which fundamentally cannot be broken apart and labeled. Now, making any comparison is really not a fair thing to do, because no two things are alike. Even two things that seem very similar to one another are so fundamentally different in so many real ways that to compare them is not to do justice to either of them. However, if we're to use language at all, the role of language is to look for the commonalities, look for the points of contact whereby we can compare things. If we can use language at all, it's using them in a way that can stretch across two things and unite them. Even to use a term like religion or mysticism at all is assuming that there is something between Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Hindu, Taoist, and Baha'i mysticism that can all be rightly called mysticism. So, having said all that, we do begin to see a beautiful theme emerging here amongst pantheistic traditions, which is this principle of some fundamentally incomprehensible order to reality, some fundamental pattern of existence. The Stoics called it logos, Spinoza called it God or nature, Deus sive natura, the Chinese called it the Tao, which we can silently observe, learn from, and because fundamentally we are not other than it, because we are also nature, we are part of the stars, we are the cosmos, we are existence, we can live at ease and in accordance with the patterns and order of nature, and not brush up and fight against it. We can accept reality as she is, and learn to flow with the universe. I know that sounds super hippie, but this may be one of the wisest and most patient teachings of ancient religion, both East and West. To quote the great Chinese philosopher Zhuangzi, "The sage has the sun and moon by their side, and the universe under their arm. They blend everything into a harmonious whole." Now, although people may chuff against this categorization of Daoism as pantheistic, I think it is fair to count Daoism amongst the pantheologies, be it pantheistic or panentheistic. And I know people will accuse me of applying Christian categories of theology eastward to places where they simply don't belong. But to quote Douglas Duckworth in his essay Buddha Nature and the Logic of Pantheism, we should remember that the term theology predates classical Christian theology. It was used by the Greeks, and in a time when today's demarcation between East and West was not so firmly established, and ideas flowed between the two, pollinating and fertilizing one another. And to label the Tao, which really should not be labeled with any labels at all, with the label God, which would be a prerequisite and a consequence of considering it a pantheology, theos, God, seems justifiable on the great philosopher-theologian Paul Tillich's definition of God and theology, as one's object of ultimate concern. The object of theology is what concerns us ultimately, says Tillich. The object of ultimate concern for the Taoist is the Tao, and living in accordance with it. Hence, propositions regarding the Tao are theological on Tillich's definition, because they are objects of ultimate concern. And once we're quoting Tillich already, he might help us understanding what we're calling God in Daoism, with his definition of God as the ground of being, an idea that dates back all the way in Christian mysticism to at least Jacob Boehme. Many confusions in the doctrine of God and many apologetic weaknesses could be avoided if God were understood, first of all, as being itself, or as the ground of being, says Tillich. And on this definition we can count Daoism and the Tao as bona fide cases of pantheism. The Tao, the central underlying metaphysical and naturalistic principle of the system pervading this self-regulating cosmos in its totality. The Tao, the ultimate ineffable principle containing the entire universe, yet also called empty, the nothing, the no thing. The same word, the emptiness of all concepts, when taken as an abstraction, becomes the most meaningful of all concepts, when it is understood as the power of being in everything that has being. Also, talking about nothing makes a great segue to the next great tradition we're going to be looking at, a tradition which is obsessed with nothing, Buddhism. Buddhism arose in India in the 6th to 5th centuries BCE at the hands of Siddhartha Gautama, who was given the title Buddha, which literally means the enlightened or awakened one, and later spread throughout the East. Buddhism developed at a time when India was in the midst of a serious religious and philosophical crisis, and Buddhism was one of the many schools of thought which developed in the vacuum and in response to what was perceived as the failures of orthodox Hinduism to address the needs of the people. And thanks to the pragmatic and humanistic emphasis of it, it rose to a prominence as an alternative to Hinduism, and eventually as becoming one of the world's great religious traditions, claiming over 500 million or 7% of the world population as its adherents today. In ways that will sound familiar to what we just learned about Daoism, Siddhartha Gautama the Buddha taught that desire and attachment and ignorance of the true nature of our reality causes human suffering, because people hold on to impermanent states and things and relationships and situations, and they resist the change that inevitably is going to come when those things don't last anymore, clinging to what we know and mourning what we lose. In his quest for a means of living without suffering, Buddha recognized that life was in a constant state of change and nothing is permanent, and that one could find inner peace through a spiritual discipline to recognize the beauty in the transience of life, while preventing one from becoming too attached to impermanent objects, people, and situations. The Buddha boiled his teachings of how one can escape from samsara, the cycle of suffering, death, rebirth, and attain nirvana, into 4 noble truths. Number 1, dukkha, usually translated as suffering, but can also be translated as dissatisfaction, is an inherent characteristic of existence. Life is suffering. Number 2, dukkha arises from tanha, which means craving, desire, and attachment. That's the source of suffering. 3, the cessation of dukkha can be attained with the letting go of tanha. By letting go of our cravings and attachments, we lose our suffering. And number 4, that the Noble Eightfold Path leads to a letting go of tanha and a cessation of dukkha, a letting go of attachments and an end of suffering. The Eightfold Path consists of right view, right resolve, right speech, right conduct, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right samadhi, which means a unified state of consciousness, or basically a mystical experience in plain English. Buddhism is a tricky tradition in any comparative sketch of mysticism, many arguing that it does not belong there at all. This is particularly the case when discussing pantheistic mystical traditions, because the Buddha was famously agnostic, choosing to plead the fifth on questions of metaphysical and theological speculation, because he believed that they were just that, mere speculation, which did little, if anything, to help free people of their predicament of suffering, which was the whole point of his Eightfold Path, and instead directed people in a pragmatic program to end their suffering. However, speculation, metaphysics, and theology did not stay apart from Buddhism forever. And about 600 years after the passing of the Buddha, a rather speculative school of Buddhism arose to challenge the 20 or so schools of Buddhism that were then in existence. One of the early representatives of this new philosophical school, which later became known as the Mahayana tradition in Buddhism, Sanskrit for the great vehicle, the Merkava in Hebrew, was Ashvaghosha. Ashvaghosha not only distinguished between the pure absolute, the soul as suchness, and the all-producing, all-conserving mind, which is the manifestation of the absolute, i.e. the happenings of reality, but he also held that judgment concerning the manifest world of beings is a judgment coming from a place of non-enlightenment. It is, he says, like the waves stirred by the wind. When the quiet of enlightenment comes, the waves cease, and likewise all the illusions which confront a human being, when he begins to really understand the world, cease as well. Whereas Ashvaghosha treated the world as illusory and essentially void, empty, Nagarjuna, the great propagator of Mahayana Buddhism, who received no less a title than the second Buddha, who had studied under one of Ashvaghosha's students, and perhaps one of the greatest philosophers Buddhism has ever produced, transferred the doctrine of shunyata, emptiness, the void, into the place of the absolute. If suchness or ultimate reality and the void, the shunyata, are identical, then the ultimate must lie beyond any possible description. Beginning with the Madhyamaka, the middle way school, the doctrine of shunyata, emptiness, spread throughout these schools of Mahayana Buddhism, as well as to the Satyasiddhi groups in Theravada Buddhism. And since shunyata is also called the highest synthesis of all oppositions, the doctrine of shunyata may be viewed as an instance of an identity of opposites, a coincidente oppositorum pantheism. I'd like to end with this thought. Another way to refer to the dichotomy between the world of appearances and the reality of pure thusness, the relative and the absolute, is under the names of samsara and nirvana. Samsara referring to the world of transience, of suffering, of death and rebirth, and nirvana referring to the realm of cessation, of bliss, of the absolute, of the all-extinguishing thusness. It's with this in mind that I would like to read you a quote from Schopenhauer. Pantheists give to samsara the name God, and mystics, on the other hand, give the same name to nirvana. Of this, however, they relate more than they can know. This the Buddhists do not do, and so their nirvana is just a relative nothing. From this quote, it seems like Schopenhauer had not read his Nagarjuna well, or even at all, because one of the central theses that we find stressed in the teachings of Nagarjuna is that form is emptiness and emptiness is form, i.e. that samsara is no other than nirvana and nirvana is no other than samsara. That this thisness is the thusness. That if we can stretch our language a little here, both samsara and nirvana are both God. I'll let you chew on that and we can cap our dive into Buddhism here because I don't want to get too deep into the philosophical side of pantheism. We're going to get into a separate video where we talk about the philosophy and metaphysics that come up because this was supposed to be just a historical presentation of the key traditions and thinkers in whom pantheism plays a central role. If you're excited to hear about more of the metaphysics, make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video, and stay tuned when we hit the metaphysical side of pantheism. But next up will be Greek pantheism. We're going to talk about the Ionians, the Eleatics, Parmenides, Plato, Pythagoras, and Neoplatonism, Plotinus. It's going to be very cool. Stay tuned, and meanwhile, keep seeking.